you. Okay, thank you very much, Nick. We're going to see if I can do this in 20 minutes because I have a lot to say. My name is Breana, like Killeen. I'm a dietitian. I'm also a chef. I did not go to CIA. I went to Cordon Bleu, London. My father is from Hong Kong. My mother is Austrian Ashkenazi Jew from New York, and I grew up in the South. And I now live in Vermont, 40 miles from Canada. And so it's been a wild ride, but I moved up to Vermont to work at this little tiny magazine almost 12 years ago called Eating Well. And the idea being I had this balance of being a chef. I also was a dietitian, but my idea is, well, isn't there a middle ground between those two? And the first recipe that I developed, I pitched a recipe from my childhood that was called mapo tofu. And we took that recipe into the test kitchen, and we made it with turkey, and we made it a pound of meat instead of a third of a pound, which it usually had. And we changed all the seasonings, and we published it. And it was the first recipe with my byline, which was very exciting. I had worked nights for a very long time, and I was very excited to work during the day. And also being an Asian Jew, my mom was like, "You're finally in print." And all that money we spent for all that education, finally. It's a big deal. And I look back on that recipe now, and I give this talk, and it's an example of everything not to do. So, let's get started. Does anybody remember this? This was in 2020. This is soup Jumo. This was a recipe that was printed by Bon Appetit. Soup Jumo is a Haitian soup that is eaten on New Year's to commemorate a couple different things. One, it's New Year's. Second, it was also the independence from the French colony, from French colonizers, and they were finally able to eat the soup that they were not allowed to have. It was not taken well because it was not the soup that they believed and really that they had always eaten. It was a completely different version of it, and it had one ingredient that was the same, and that was butternut squash. Everything else was different. You were missing beef, potatoes, carrots, cabbage, celery, leek, turnips, Scotch bonnet pepper, and pasta. What you got was coconut milk, Berber, maple syrup. Not going to say anything bad about maple syrup. Almonds, nutmeg, allspice, and cinnamon. And now you're looking at a photo of a traditional version. And there was a very, very, very large backlash. And this happened because, A, the soup was very different, right? But essentially it was taken and made palatable for the Bon Appetit audience. And there was no mention of where the inspiration for this soup came from and that it was changed in so many different ways. And so very soon after, and there's a Reddit thread, there was a lot written about it. There was some firing of some people. A new recipe was posted with a 1 star, which I think it would have gotten 0 stars if you could vote 0 stars. And it had a new headnote. And this is an example, as we all know, of how do we take a recipe, and actually be able to publish it. And we're very scared now, right? How do we do it and we not get canceled? How do we do it in a respectable way? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So what is cultural appropriation? Well, it's essentially taking that recipe, taking something, and not saying where it came from, profiting off of it, and that essentially leading into the continuation of certain stereotypes. Let's get into a few more examples. This is a very good one. Does anybody eat congee? We call it joke. Okay. My dad eats it every morning for breakfast. His isn't my favorite. He only puts a little bit of ginger in. I think that's kind of boring. So I put a lot of other things in. That's my take on it. I still call it joke. It still has the same basic ingredients, right? the queen of kanji, that's what she called herself, an acupuncturist out of Oregon, said, I spent a lot of time modernizing it for the Western palate, making a kanji that you can eat and find delicious and that doesn't seem foreign. And her reimagined kanji was the gourmet foodie version of a traditional dish that's kind of weird. And you're cringing now, right? It's like, oh, gosh. But this used to be pretty normal. You know, as a kid I had this very cool little thermos that my dad would pack. And on the top, you could have hot food, and on the bottom, it had a little sauce dish. And I said, Dad, you remember when you used to pack me dumplings? I will eat dumplings every day for the rest of my life, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and wine. But I said, you know, I used to get made fun of a lot, right? I grew up in the South. Nobody looked like me. And he goes, oh, you must have forgotten when I packed you the whole head-on shrimp. And I said, yes, I did. I must have blocked that out of my mind because all I wanted to eat was the square pizza because that would have made me normal, right? That would have made me fit in. So when you have something like this, a kanji dish, where now it's this sort of weird thing, it's repackaged. By the way, she started selling this as a prepackaged kit for $15. She apologized, but she continued to sell it. And so it's one thing, right, if we say, oh, I'm sorry, whoops, but we don't make any changes, and we don't move forward, and we don't say, okay, yeah, all right, maybe shouldn't have done that. Maybe I should give credit, and maybe I shouldn't say that this weird dish, which kind of insinuates where it comes from, is also kind of weird. So anybody who, when I have a little bit longer to give this presentation, I often ask people to raise their hand and admit what the weird food is that they like to eat, that they kind of won't tell people. Everybody's thinking of theirs now. Okay, so the next one is another example I want to give. This was a restaurant that came out just a few years ago in New York. It was by a health coach. Dietitians, we love health coaches. They did all that schooling, they did all those internships, they do all those CEUs. It's fabulous. But you know what? They make a lot of money, so we're doing something wrong, right? Restaurant opened. The Chinese food had no dairy. We eat so much dairy. No MSG. It was gluten-free, and it was clean. Clean. I work on a farm. I have a farm. We have over 200 chickens. I have about 60 turkeys right now for 2 more weeks. 9 cows, and vegetables. And you know what? There's a lot of dirtiness there. When vegetables come out of the ground, they are not clean. Food from someone else's culture, when you say it's not clean, what have Chinese restaurateurs been trying to deal with for a very, very, very long time? The insinuation that their food is not clean, and by proxy that they aren't either. So, to put this into practice, how do you develop a recipe when you are not of that specific culture or ethnicity? Well, I could say, don't be an asshole, which is kind of the premise of this whole talk, but really do your homework. Do your homework. Where does that authentic recipe come from? And don't just look at the first SEO page that comes up when you type in a recipe, because there are some really, really good forces behind there who are making that come to the first page. Because do you know how many people go to the second page of a Google search? Not a lot. So sometimes, guess what? You're going to have to pick up a book. You're going to have to look at those first sections and say, all right, well, this is actually what maybe an authentic version of it is. And I want to say an authentic version because there's lots of authentic versions. There are a lot of Italian grandmothers who make meatballs, and they are all very good, and it is authentic to them. But there are key ingredients, like in that soup Jumo, that make it a soup Jumo. Yes, maybe they switch up the pasta. Yep, maybe they don't always use butternut, they use kabocha, but it's still a squash. And then once you do your homework, give credit. It does not make you a bad chef. It does not make you a bad cook. Give credit to where it's from. There are a lot of chocolate chip cookie recipes. If you got it from the back of the Toll House box, just give credit. great, your cookie still tastes good. Now, I worked in magazines for a long time. We didn't have a lot of space in print. If you're in digital now, you can write all you want, right? You're like scrolling, you're like, jump to the frickin' recipe. But if you don't have a lot of space, right, still, this is your time to be able to educate people. You can still say dark soy sauce, and then if you don't have the room to say, or light soy sauce, molasses, and a little bit of sugar, use your Headnote. That's that little description, or long description, that you saw with Soup Jumo afterwards, that gives context. Where did the inspiration for this recipe come from? Where can you source those ingredients? Do you have a certain spice place that you like to get it? Did this recipe come from you going to your favorite Thai restaurant? This is your interpretation of it. That's the Headnote. So in that you can say, yes, you can use light soy sauce. However, dark soy sauce is sweeter, less salty. So if you're going to use light soy sauce, give it a little bit of molasses or sugar or anything sweet that you have. Maple syrup, fine. It's fine. Okay. If there isn't a good substitute, why not? Talk about it. Like palm oil, right? The substitutes are coconut oil or ghee. Will they work? Yes. If you substitute it, being a recipe writer for a long time, and I always answered the phone. I was the test kitchen manager, and people would call me, and they'd be like, your recipe didn't work. Called for cauliflower. I used turkey. And you're like, cool. And then they're like, but I followed it. I followed the whole recipe, and you just know, great, that's fine, and you say, well, why did it not work? Well, and you go through it. So if the substitutes are different, fine, but explain how the product is going to be different. It's not going to look the same. It's not going to have the same color. Your photo's not going to be the same, and it's not going to taste the same. You will still have a recipe that comes out well if you follow it, but it'll be different. Also, let's not italicize ingredients in other languages. It basically automatically signals non-white. Describing an ingredient as exotic, newly discovered, or trendy, to whom? Ramen's not trendy. We've been eating a long time. Okay, recipe titles should be written in the language of origin. If you do have any questions, please know that I'm here. If you are deviating from a classic, let's say you're changing that authentic version, but you're deviating that tiniest bit. So in this example, instead of using chicken, you're using lentils. The ingredients are the same. The method is the same. You still can call it the same thing, but just quantify what you changed. If you change it entirely, you do not have that same recipe anymore, and you can use that Headnote to describe and say, I got my inspiration from a Fessenden. This is my version of it. I used mushrooms. I didn't have any walnuts. I used pecans. I decided I didn't want to simmer it. I just was going to make it really quickly. That's what you have a different recipe. Okay, so this talk all came about 3 years ago at big nutrition conference. I spoke with 4 other Asian dietitians, and we basically said we are not all the same. By the way, one was from the Middle East, one was from India, one was from mainland China, and I'm Hong Kong Chinese. Guess what? We're all Asian. So when you just say Asian lettuce wraps, what does that mean? Describe actually what it is. Use the flavors, like Nick was talking about, to describe what it is. You have a more educated audience than you think you do. That Headnote portion is where you get to talk about where did that inspiration come from. If you don't have the ability to have lots of words, use Asian-inspired or Asian style. You've probably seen that now a lot more. You've probably used it. Do your homework. Is it authentic? Describe how so. If not, just describe those changes and why you made them. If you didn't have 2 hours to make the recipe and you had to make it in 30 minutes, or if you're trying to make a healthier version of it, don't just say I made a healthy version of it. Say, I changed these things. It added fiber. It added nutrients. It added vitamin A and vitamin K and vitamin D. Give people the idea of why it was healthier. Give credit. Where did it come from? And avoid saying you made it better. You made it your version. Not necessarily, but maybe you think it's better, great. But when we're writing this out, it's not necessarily better. Okay, photography. And if anybody knows where this photo is from, you read the New York Times article last week about a very good example of someone who gets a lot of hits, a lot of hits online, and hasn't changed a thing. So, this is a Thai dish. Anybody see any mistakes? Chopsticks. By the way, what type of chopsticks are those? They're Japanese. There are different types of chopsticks. Korean chopsticks are wide, metal, and flat. Filipino do not use chopsticks. Thai, yes, but with noodles. No noodles. Chinese chopsticks are rounder at the end. Japanese chopsticks are finer. And don't add in, just show authentic garnishes and props. Okay, let's show an example of somebody who's doing it really well, and that is the New York Times. If you need an example of they're just really hitting it, look at their recipe, the New York Times cooking section. You have the name in origin, you have the name in the origin, the language of origin, with English in parentheses. Gives credit. Where did the recipe originally come from? It also gives context. What exactly are drunken noodles? Oh, hangover food, hangover prevention. Great. The chef in this recipe calls for a Dutch oven, and she describes why. She's like, I had this coil stove in New York City, and it was actually easier than trying to manage a wok, and it works really well. And then provided substitutions. Don't have Thai basil? Great. Use Italian basil with a little bit of lime zest. Oh, my most favorite slide. Okay. These are words. I know everybody's like pulling out their phone, right? I have used every single one of these words. Exotic to whom? It's a white-centered term. Weird. Might be different for you. It's not weird for someone else. Manly, girly, I put this in here. Why are we assigning gender to food? If you are a woman, can you not grill? If you are a man, are you not allowed to have pink drinks? And while we're at it, if we're going to talk about communities of color, let's also, why are we talking about white trash? And then these ones at the end, because I'm a dietitian, I am putting this in here too. These are terms that elicit some serious emotions for a lot of people, and a lot of people who might be struggling with something else, so let's not call something sinful, binge-worthy, clean, or put guilt associated with it. And then words to use cautiously. Ethnic to whom, right? Just in general, ethnic just means a grouping of people who come together, who are grouped together by tradition, by culture. But usually, ethnic has been used to talk about foods with people from communities of color, yes. Would Jewish food be considered ethnic? Yes. Would Christian food? So think about how you use the term. Cheap eats. Yes. All American. I was born in the US. Does that mean that the food that I make isn't American? Think about what you think of when you say American food and what comes to your mind. And healthy. Just blanketly saying healthy, we all know now, could be anything, right? Instead of just saying healthy, like I said before, describe why. Why is it healthier? We decided to swap the white rice for brown rice, not just because it's healthy, because you get an extra gram of fiber, and guess what? Everybody could use a little more fiber. There's one nutrient we all need more of, right? I think the number one titled article, or one of the top articles, is always like, how to help you poop at Eating Well. Everybody wants more fiber. Everybody does, right? So if you're gonna say healthy, say why. Because also it is your opportunity to educate the people that you are serving food. Now it's really hard to get up and talk right in front of people because I'm always like, well, I'm gonna say something wrong. I'm gonna do something wrong. Somebody's gonna cancel me. Somebody's gonna say, you shouldn't have done that, you shouldn't have said that. But here's the thing is we are all learning, and we've all made these mistakes, and we're all gonna make them in the future. But if we don't continue to get up here and talk about it, and for somebody to say, you know what, I don't agree with that, great, let's talk about it, and why. Thank you very much for having me.
Have time for a couple of questions if you want to type them into Slido. And I'm just gonna, because we only have a few minutes, I'm not gonna bring out the chairs and things. Do you mind just standing?
Yeah,
and sharing a microphone? Perfect. So one thing that I'll start off with is a question for both of you. And so, as Rupa mentioned, you know, as we grapple with the big questions around food, we're talking about ideas of cultural authenticity, appropriation, and ownership that seem especially relevant. And so I am wondering, you know, what does this theme of authenticity, flavor, in the future mean to you? How do you engage with this idea of authenticity? Is it relevant still? Do we need to move beyond it? Are there times when it's important?
So two things. One of the things to remember is that borders is a very new concept relative to the world. Nations were not really present for a really long time. People have been immigrating, and so have ingredients and plants and vegetables naturally, as well as by people. I'm also from a mixed cultural background, and so often I get questions, why did you do it that way? And I often have to remind people that I am not your grandmother. So I'm never going to cook like your grandmother, right? This is something you brought up too, is that we cook the way we see things. So my food is an expression of what I've been through. It is culturally appropriate to me, but I also do my homework, which is what she mentioned earlier, which is so important, because at the end of the day, if I'm teaching people to cook, I can't look like an idiot. So I have to list my references and resources and say, this is where the story comes from, this is what has influenced me, and this is how I'm shaping the conversation around it.
Do you want to ask another question?
Okay.
Yeah.
So we do have two questions about Breana, when you had talked about why shouldn't people say kaffir lime? Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so kaffir, it's essentially, so in South Africa, saying kaffir is essentially the same as saying an N-word. And it's talking about, it's in reference to the people who were there, who came, and who were picking those leaves.
And I just want to say, too, when I first got Breana's PowerPoint, I didn't know the thing that there were different types of chopsticks, you know? And so I think, and I want to thank you, because, you know, in talking about, there was a point where you use these words, right? That I think that's the thing, is that culture is always changing, and that we, you know, and in having these conversations, we're not positioning, we're not going old school and like we know and you don't and we're here, you know, like that this, I just want to be really humble in this moment and just say that, right? Like that really was a thing that I was like, oh, I didn't know. But so we have time. Let me see if there's any more questions. But actually, so let's, can we dive more into ethnic?
Oh.
Because I do think that, I was telling Breana earlier,
this is a hard one.
like we grapple with this, right? That sometimes
sure.
I will read it or I'll hear it and it hits me in the pit of my stomach. But then also I was listening to a BBC podcast that said ethnic Albanians. And so I was like, this is a word that I think sometimes in our culture, like it's super complicated, you know, that we are, and it seems like, I feel like now that we are learning a lot. Like we are learning a lot. And so could you talk more about that?
Yeah, so ethnic, you know, I put that in the words to use cautiously for a reason, because, you know, when you said, sometimes you kind of go, ooh, that doesn't feel right. Well, you know, any time that you're doing something and you're like, I don't know if that's quite right, That's something to think, to recognize in yourself. You're going, why do I feel that way? And so there's very much a time when, ethnicity is a word that is important, right? But ethnic to whom? What group are you talking about? And how is that word used in whatever you are writing and whatever you are saying? Is it meant to say non-white? Or are you specifically trying to talk about, a certain group that is an ethnicity? And so I think it's just a word to keep track of and think how you're going to use it, I'm trying to think of that example of, when you move a word from the front to the end of a sentence and it's you said something completely different. Just look back and look how you are using the word to know, well, is it used in a way that you're like, oh, that wasn't quite what I meant to say, or is it really used appropriately?
Okay, great. So we're going to have to cut it short, but I do want to give a shout out to Hamilton High School, Chandler, Arizona. But also to say thanks to Nick and Breana. Nick will be signing his book, Veg Table, Recipes, Techniques, and Plant Science for Big Flavored, Vegetable-Focused Meals at tonight's opening marketplace. And if you could give Breana and Nick a round of applause.